So seeing the fractured T's done well in Breaking Bad allowed me to really understand it in a much broader context. And so for me, that's exciting. That's like when I start jumping up and down. I'm like, oh my God, I finally cracked this thing. It took me years, but I finally cracked it, and nobody else cares. Like, I'm the only one who's like obsessed with this stuff.
Welcome to Hallowed Ground Storycast. I'm Anya.
And I'm Alan.
And I'm Lani Diane Rich, and this episode is about the TV show that made me want to be a writer, Moonlighting.
Dead bodies and all, I did have fun.
Me too.
So Alan, why don't you introduce our guest?
So this week we are joined by one girl in all the world, slayer of prologues, speaker of chipperish, New York Times best-selling author, Lani Diane Rich. Welcome to Hallowed Ground Storycast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So for those of you who don't know, Moonlighting was an ABC comedy drama that ran from 1985 to 1989 about the Blue Moon Detective Agency. Maddie Hayes, a former model in financial trouble, is the owner of the business, and David Addison is the chief detective. The duo solve various mysteries each week and try to keep the business solvent, all while trying to resist a passionate attraction for each other. Glenn Gordon Caron, the showrunner and creator, said that the show's premise came to him while watching a performance of Taming of the Shrew. Production of the show was notoriously late, taking 14 days to film an episode that was scheduled for 7. Caron was given a lot of leeway by ABC and was a perfectionist. Various production problems also came from the two lead stars, Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis. Sybil's pregnancy with twins was not incorporated into the plot and led to an awkward shooting schedule, and Bruce Willis's budding movie career demanded his time.
So, Lani, how did you first encounter Moonlighting?
I first found Moonlighting over the summer. It had started in 1985 as a mid-season replacement. So the first season was like 6 episodes. And over the summer, I was home one night. I happened to catch the movie premiere on ABC as it was rerunning. And I instantly fell in love with it. I loved everything about it. It was wonderful. I watched it every week. I taped it. I had the VHS videotapes all time. I had the timer ready to go so I couldn't accidentally miss it. Everything. I was so into this show. And I remember telling all of my friends about it, and they had no idea. And I was like, yeah, it's with this woman, Sybil Shepherd, and then this guy, Bill Willis. I remember I thought his name was Bill Willis for the longest time. And then eventually I figured it out. But it was one of those things, like one of those moments in your life where you are so struck with something. It is so powerfully speaking to you. That you just never forget it. Like I have such a vivid memory of, being downstairs in our like a little living room area in the basement watching this show and just loving it.
What do you think about it spoke to you? Was it like the snappy dialogue or like the stars, the way it was shot? What was it that grabbed you?
I think it was everything. I think for me, it was that romance. I mean, Moonlighting is the reason why I became a romance writer. I mean, that and Days of Our Lives, which we can talk about on another one of these.
Yes.
But I loved the romance. I loved how funny it was, how snappy it was. I mean, at that time, we had a lot of these detective shows like Scarecrow and Mrs. King and Remington Steele.
Yeah.
And it was a thing where you'd have this, this guy and this girl, and they liked each other, and you'd see the romance develop, but nobody was as edgy and funny, and had the energy that Moonlighting had. It was such a strange moment in time because it kind of changed the way that those things are done. It moved the boundaries on that a little bit. And I like that. I like those shows that come in and kind of move the needle, and push what they're doing on TV into a new and different space. A lot of things that Moonlighting did, it was the first time we'd ever seen anything like that.
Totally.
So when you say that it made you want to be a writer, was it sort of like as you were watching it, you thought, I want to make something like that? Or was it more like it planted a seed that germinated later on.
Well, I think it did a lot for me. What a lot of products do today, properties do today for people when they write fan fiction, right? A lot of people don't necessarily who write fan fiction don't necessarily want to be writers, but they just want to live in that world for a little while longer. There isn't enough story available for them, so they create more story. And fan fiction when I was a kid was not a thing. Like nobody talked about fan fiction. That was, I mean, I'm sure there were people doing it, but nobody talked about it. So I remember like the first thing I had only those 6 episodes. I had them on reruns over the summer. I was waiting for the new season to come out. And I was like, I want more of this show. And so I would go into my little notebook and I would just write scripts, just by hand, and write dialogue for them and think about things that they could do and what would happen. And so for me, I think that was where it really started. I had always kind of been a writer, like through childhood. I was in the gifted program when I was a kid, not because of my grades, but because of my writing. And so it was one of those things that like it had always kind of come easily to me, and I did it in school as was required, and it was fun, but it was never something that I did like really outside of school that much. It was just this show made me want more story in that arena. And I think that there are remnants of Moonlighting and especially David Addison in so much of my books that I've written, like as an adult. There's Moonlighting is a clear influence on what I've done.
Oh, absolutely. When I watched it, I came back to it for this and I was like, oh, this is so Lani. Like the way his sarcasm and how snappy it is, and the way that they talk over each other, and just how tight the dialogue is. And I've heard you talk so many times about how dialogue is not just people talking, it's actually doing something in the story. And this show is so that, like, when they are in each other's offices, it is not them just expositing or something like that. It is a duel.
It is. I mean, it's verbal jousting. Like he's got a point of view, she's got a point of view. They have this conflict, and it's always, I want to take this case. I don't want to take this case. And the kinds of cases that one of them wants to take in one episode will be completely flipped in the other episode, and you're like, none of this is consistent. But you know what? I don't care because it's so much fun. And I mean, them talking over each other was something that just was not done. And they did that. They broke the fourth wall. I mean, they did so many things, in this show that were so interesting and so bold. And I think part of that was because Glenn Gordon Caron he was young. He was like in his, I think, mid to late 20s when he got this show. And he hadn't been kind of beaten down by the Hollywood system yet. He'd written like a couple of Remington Steels, and he was like, sure, I'll do the show, came up with this idea and did it. But he was so young. Like he had a lot of bad habits, definitely had a lot of bad habits. There's a lot of things in Moonlighting that he shouldn't have done, but it was because he lacked that kind of self-consciousness and that discipline that he was doing this genius stuff that nobody had ever seen before. So I think that was kind of the price you paid for it.
Right. And when I was researching like in IMDb and Wikipedia and stuff, like I'm not an expert on Moonlighting or anything, but one of the things that they did say about that was kind of unique about the production was at this time when they gave him that gig, part of the reason that they gave somebody so young and inexperienced that gig was because they weren't getting like the licensing rights from an independent production studio. They were doing it in-house at ABC. And so it was a lot cheaper all around for them. And they were like, we don't care what you make as long as it's about detectives. Like, do whatever you want. It really doesn't matter.
Right.
And so he just had like the purview to kind of go nuts, and nobody was really watching over his shoulder. And it took off because it's so singular.
So I know that Bruce Willis was not famous at all before Moonlighting, right? Like Moonlighting was sort of how he got his start and then transitioned into movies. But what about Sybil Shepherd? Was she well known at this point?
I think she was fairly well known. She'd done some movies. She'd been a model. She was sort of, just one of those pretty blondes, that like people kind of had an awareness of, because she'd done some stuff. But she was the big star. Like at that time, the name was Sybil Shepherd, and then there was this dude Bruce Willis that nobody
mean Bill
knew.
Willis? Sorry,
Bill Willis. Yes, there was Bill. And so like nobody knew who he was, but he was the thing. Like he was what got me into this show. Like Sybil Shepherd, I've never really felt a connection with. I've never really liked her that much, but her with him and what he brought to it, it was so fantastic. And I have to tell you, like, I in my romantic life have been, swooned by many a David Addison. It never works out well. It never ends well. But man, I fall for that, like that fast talking, funny, laissez-faire guy. I love that. But it's not the kind of relationship you want to have, because the kind of guy who can do that is usually not the kind of guy who's like very, honest and straightforward and emotionally connected. Like, he's going to give you trouble. That is going to be, one of those wild bucking bronco rides. But I mean, I think it could be worth it in some circumstances, at least for temporary, situations.
Yeah, at least for the feeling in the moment and the story afterward.
Oh yeah, it's fun though. I dated David Addison all over the place in college. Never ended well.
I think the show bears that out. It's not like he's a great guy or anything in the show, but yeah, he is the main draw. I think all the energy is there. And we've been going along with your other show, Big Strong Yes, and I was thinking from Big Magic about like the trickster spirit, and he's totally a trickster, right?
Oh, David Addison is complete trickster, total trickster energy. I mean, you can see it in that pilot episode, right? When he tricks her constantly. When he takes the watch from her, and gives her the watch he got at graduation. When he's in her house when she comes back from her date, and introduces himself as Papa Bear, right. And pretends he's doing the dishes. Like, he has absolutely that very fun, that mercurial kind of trickster energy. And I think that as a romantic hero in fiction, that actually can work out, because we do see him in certain parts of the overall story arc towards seriousness. And when he does serious stuff, when he's like, he is there, he is excellent at that, because some people can be really funny, but they can't deliver the drama and the emotion. But he can really deliver the drama and the emotion, like the episode where his brother comes to town, right? Mm-hmm. And he's so like, that's the first time. It's the season opener for season 2, and his brother comes to town. He's got this really strained relationship with his brother, and then his brother and Maddie starts sort of having a thing, and that obviously bothers him a great deal. But he delivers that emotion so powerfully that you can see that there's a lot of real stuff going on underneath that facade, that trickster facade, and I absolutely love that combination of, he's light and he's funny and he takes nothing seriously, except he does take things seriously. And when he does, it.
He's very competent. Like, he tells her in the pilot, like, I'm the best. And you're kind of like, whatever with this guy. But then he really is. Like, he is always on top of the mystery. He's always the one that kind of cracks the case and leads them forward. His instincts are really good. Mm-hmm. He's just so, it seems like the way that they wrote him, he's just so smart that he's like bored.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, he's absolutely that guy. And I like it when he says, we lost money. Of course we lost money. We were supposed to lose money. We lost money. Great. But now you turn around and you say you want to make money. We're going to make money. Great. Like, he had that. I will quote this thing verbatim. Like, I know this. It is in my brain. I've been watching these episodes so much. But I mean, I love that he does have that capability that, he was supposed to lose money and he did. And he hired, like, what always cracks me up is that they have absolutely no money, but they have a full staff. There's never less than 9 people.
There's so many people there.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, what exactly are you doing with all of these people? I mean, they're just sitting there doing nothing. They're partying all day, and it's kind of funny at the same time. I'm like, how do you possibly justify that you're, when you're supposed to lose money? Yes, having 9 people on the payroll not doing anything and no cases to solve, that's fine. But when they're struggling and they're talking about how, they have no money for anything. And I'm like, well, then, I mean, I appreciate that these people need a job, but you let people go. Yeah. Like, if there are no phones to answer, if there's no legwork to be done, you don't pay people to do something you're not having them do. So I always thought that was, it was one of these things that, like, it existed in a reality that is not reality. And they doubled down on that when they started breaking the fourth wall, having them look to camera, make jokes about there's pages missing from my, my copy of the script, that kind of thing. So they always, like, nobody ever expects Moonlighting to be like a documentary. It is not about what it would really be. It's about how that experience feels, which is what fiction always is. It's never about reality. It's about believability. And even when they didn't have any money and had all these people, it was emotionally believable. Like, you were there with them. It's really good.
So I had actually never even heard of the show until Lani first started talking about it on, I don't even know what context. Yeah.
It comes into every show
Yeah.
I've ever done. I don't think there's a single show I've done where I have not at least mentioned Moonlighting once.
Yeah, so basically it first got put on my radar just from listening to Lani talk about it. And then when we started this podcast, I was like, I know what we need to do. Because this podcast is essentially a structure that we designed so that we can podcast, Alan and me, about what we want to podcast. And I was like, I know that Lani wants to podcast about moonlighting, but she doesn't have the proper vehicle for that. So like we built the scaffolding. Come hang out here.
And thank you for that. I can't talk about moonlighting because moonlighting is not available. There was a brief window, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, where the DVDs were available and you could grab them, but it's not available on streaming. It's not, on reruns anywhere. And so I don't want to do a show about something that people can't watch, because I always feel like, there's no point to it. But as I was watching, I mean, I have all of the DVDs. I have everything. I watched the whole run in prep for this, from beginning to end again. And I was thinking, like, there's so many things that I would love to talk about, both that they did well and that they did really, really poorly. And I'd love to go into it in detail, but I can't, because there's nobody you can't access it. I think some of it's on YouTube, so you can grab some of it there, but there's no real reliable place. This needs to be on Netflix. It needs to be on Hulu. I don't know why. I mean, I think it's probably comes down to music licensing, which was the big delay with getting it on DVD. There's a lot of music. There's a lot of it's from the 60s. A lot of it's, that kind of thing. But they have one episode that opens up with the Rolling Stones, and getting the rights. Getting the rights. We have a lot of these TV shows that sort of fell into this sort of crack in the sidewalk before. When you license this stuff for a show as it's airing, you license it for the airing and you license it for the syndication later. But at that time, they had no idea that technology was going to do what it did, that they were going to be streaming, that there was going to be the internet. It didn't exist yet, so they couldn't have predicted that. So to go back, so for these shows, to go back and get all of that licensing again, it can sometimes be almost impossible. And you will see shows that have different songs, layered in, but that means that you've got to hire an entire editing team to come in and layer in different songs. And that with Moonlighting, because their song choices were so specific, that's not as easy to do. So I think that becomes a really huge challenge in getting this on streaming, but it needs to be. And I hope that someday it will be. And if that ever does happen, I may do a short run just talking about Moonlighting, because there's so many interesting things there to talk about.
It's a fantastic show. It was really great to come back to it. I remember watching this show as a little kid with my mom, and I actually sent her a bunch of text messages in preparation for the show. I was like, I'm not crazy, right? You watched this show? And she's like, Bruce Willis, are you kidding me? Yes, I watched every second of that show.
Good woman.
Right?
Good woman.
So I would stay up and watch it with her. I think it was on Sundays or something.
Yeah, eventually it was.
I remember actually when I was watching the pilot for this episode, Sybil Shepherd walks into the detective agency and you see Miss DePesto for the first time. And I was like, oh my God, it's her. And she's going to rhyme when she answers the phone. I know what's going to happen. And she did. And I was like, oh my God, I totally remember this. I loved, she was my favorite when I was growing up watching the show.
She's fantastic.
I love her.
Elise Beasley is amazing in this show. And if you have the DVDs, you can see all this behind the scenes stuff. And you see Elise Beasley, Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis, and they are what they are, and they're big things. And then Elise Beasley, they just do an interview with her alone, and she's just like, I didn't know what to do with these people. You could just see that she was because there was so much stuff behind the scenes. They were fighting all the time, and it was drama, and it was just all this it was a crazy, crazy set. And in one of the interviews, Elise Beasley is talking about it, and she's like, this happens so rarely that as an actor, you get an opportunity to do something this, groundbreaking, this different, this good. And she's like, and she didn't mention names, but she's like, how some people could look at that and complain is beyond me. And I was like, You are a class act, Beasley, because this woman, you can just look at that and say how she must have every day coming into work just been completely flummoxed by these people. I'm not throwing any shade at anybody. I mean, it is putting on a television show is so hard and it's so demanding. And when you have somebody at the helm who also, I mean, Glenn Gordon Caron, incredibly talented guy, but, was way in over his head. I mean, obviously could not produce 22 episodes in a season. The biggest one they had, I think, was 18.
Right.
So, he got this thing that he couldn't control, that he didn't know how to run. And part of what made Moonlighting what it was his inexperience. But this is the dark side of that, that he didn't know how to handle the set. He didn't know how to handle his stars. He didn't know how to handle everything that was going on. He didn't know, he just was like so far in over his head because that lack of experience when you're, involved in a TV show, the amount of work it takes to get one of these things done in 8 days, which is the typical length of time that a TV show has to like get it together, to do an episode. That is crazy. And if you are not on top of every detail, if everything isn't going like a Swiss watch, then, things fall apart really quickly. And I felt, I felt for them. Like it's really hard. You get all of that talent with Glenn Gordon Caron, but you have no control. The whole thing is wild. And once that precedent is set, that's what you live with for the rest of the run of the show. So Moonlighting is, a lot of people take the cautionary tale of Moonlighting that you don't have your characters sleep together because then that kills the show, which is absolutely not what killed Moonlighting. That was not the problem with Moonlighting. But, there's a behind the scenes cautionary tale too, that if you give somebody with that kind of talent, the full run of a show, but with that little experience, then you're going to have this kind of problem. You need to make sure that somebody is there holding the reins and making everything, pulling it together. So
I wonder how much it would have changed things if he had had more control over the show. Like if it would have reined in the personalities of Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis, just like being on a more well-oiled machine would have led them to be like, okay, we'll put our personal issues aside and just like get this done and be professionals. If, it's sort of like as professionalism falls apart in one area, it can lead to things unraveling in others.
Oh yeah, I definitely think so. Because if think, not that they're children, but like in any, organization, you have somebody who's running the show, right? And so like everything comes from the top down, and like in any organization, in any group. And if people know that they can get away with a certain kind of behavior, they will get away with that behavior. And if other people see them getting away with that behavior, then they will also try to get away with that behavior. And if it's handled, properly, then you can keep it under wraps. You can keep it from getting out of control. But once it gets out of control, it's really hard to ride that horse back into the
Absolutely.
barn.
And just to clarify, like in case people don't know, there were like, you say that, he delivered 18 when he was contracted for 22. There would be weeks where that slot was like, the show was supposed to be there and it wasn't there. Like there was no show. The show was not ready at all. Or they were waiting until the last minute with, like a courier running in with the tape to the head office to put it in. And it's like 10 minutes late.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like that scene on Glow where that
Absolutely.
The last episode of Glow when he's like running the VHS tape or whatever down to
Oh yeah, they do that in broadcast news too, because that's a thing that happens. Like where it is absolutely at the last minute and somebody is running desperately down the hallway. We also had a situation where a lot of times the shows would be short. And so they do like a cute little intro segment that they would make up at the last minute just to fill the time, it's insane. It's insane. Like this is not how a television show, like a major studio television show is run. Like this just doesn't happen. So it's a fascinating thing to watch, from just, the perspective of the story and the fiction itself, but also from this meta perspective, coming from television production. That is what I went into. That is what I studied when I was in college, is television production. So I've never worked on like, a big show, like a big studio, but like I know generally how it goes. And I also know how much work it is. Like it is an incredible amount of work to do that every week. And then for all of the people who are not Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd on that show, like that becomes so challenging because everybody else doesn't have the option to like throw a hissy fit and go back to their trailer. Like they've got to find a way to work around all of that insanity. And I cannot even imagine what that must have been like.
I wanted to talk about the meta humor a little bit.
Wait a second. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing here. You're here because we're welcoming people back to another season. Ha. You're here because the network wants us to welcome the viewers
Double
back.
ha.
You're here because Lou told you to do it.
We can say it. The network says tonight's show is too short. The network says every show has to be 1 hour long, not 59 minutes, not 61 minutes, 60 minutes long, and we're a minute short.
Great, now the whole world knows. Mr. Thermopolis,
and do you know
Mr.
why
Ehrlich,
we're a minute short?
Karen, get my agent on the phone,
fast.
please. Not because I'm talking
once
fast,
in a while.
because you're
Maybe we could
talking
have
when
a show
I'm
that lasts
talking.
an hour. That's it, I've had
That's it. If the
producers
producers want to welcome the viewers back,
they
let
can
them
do it themselves.
Cut.
How's that?
Sorry, Sybil. Sorry, Bruce. Too short.
Too short. And you know why, don't you?
Don't even think
Because you
about
talk too
blaming
fast.
soulmates. Not because I'm talking too fast, because you're talking
Start
when
the
I'm
show.
talking. Start the show?
Start the show.
Welcome back.
It was just something that I didn't remember at all. And I was so shocked by it when it came up because for whatever reason, like my memory of Moonlighting was, you know, that it like was very episodic. Like it always reset at the end of every episode, and that it was basically like leaning on the sexual tension of these two characters. And that's kind of like all it did week to week, which having rewatched the show now, like is not true at all. And it was very innovative. One of the like crazy things is this fourth wall, like meta humor type stuff where every once in a while, Bruce Willis will turn to the camera and be like, well, we know this guy didn't do it because there's 12 minutes of episode left. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like you don't do that. Or, like at the end of the Christmas episode, like they walk off the set. It's snowing inside. They they walk off the set to sing like an entire Christmas hymn with the entire production, you know, like cast and crew, everybody and their children, right?
And
it's
family
like,
members too.
Whoa.
Right. And little soap flakes.
And it was kind of fantastic
them,
though.
like,
I was like, oh, this is like really sweet. And it makes you like emotionally invested in the show in a way that's, you know, like odd. Like you feel like, oh, this is like my nice little family that, you know, that I can come to each week. If they're there, like I can't depend on them to be there maybe, but you know, what do you think about the meta humor? Does it bother you? Are you like, this is not a good choice? Or was it like something that intrigued you?
I think that the fourth wall breaks I felt were fun and they were innovative, but I do think that the show paid a cost for that because as soon as you acknowledge, like, especially again, it's all about the believability of the world, the believability of the fiction, right? You know, as soon as you do that, you become super conscious that this is a story, you know, and you're not experiencing it the way that you would ordinarily experience it. And I think that if you're doing that within the context of pure comedy, that you don't lose that much because there isn't all that emotional weight. But we had a lot of Moonlighting that had some serious emotional weight to it. And every now and again, there would be like a moment between Dave and Maddie. Like there's this one moment where she goes, I don't give a flying fig about blah, blah, blah. And he goes, well, I got a problem. I don't know what a flying fig is. And she looks at the camera. She goes, that's okay. They do. But they were in the middle of this, like, I know the whole thing by heart. I swear to God. They have this thing. They were in this moment that was this, like, you know, kind of, they were looking each other in the eyes and it was this sexual tension. And then it killed that tension when they, you know, they look and they flirt with the audience as well, you know, and it kills the reality of it. And people were so invested in the relationship between Dave and Maddie because those emotional moments when they happened were so powerful. They were incredible. And when they look at the camera, it breaks that. And the more, and they did that more and more and more and more as time went by. And then you have, like, in season 4, you know, you have like this whole big, there's this really emotional separation between the two of them. You know, they've got all of this stuff going on. She's gone off to Chicago. He's madly in love with her. He finds out she's pregnant. It's like this whole big thing. And then we have these 2 ridiculous episodes called Cool Hand Dave, where he gets arrested and then he's like in jail. And it's this ridiculous stuff that doesn't have any, they have a musical number in it. I mean, it's crazy. So all of that kind of breaks those huge, powerful emotional lines that they have going, and it's really a shame because they had lightning in a bottle, and they let a bit of it out every time that they did that. So I mean, I like it on one hand because it's bold and it's interesting, and it moved the needle on what people could and would do on primetime television, but at the same time, it leaks some of the power that you've built up. You've built up and you've charged this power, and then you're just kind of letting it leak because of a joke you want to tell.
I think that's a really good point that you have, that the fourth wall breaks work much better in the comedic moments than in the dramatic moments. And also, I wonder how much Joss Whedon watched Moonlighting at all, because I see a lot of the similar kinds of things in Buffy, but with a much lighter touch, right? So in Buffy, they'll just say something like, "Oh, Dawn's in trouble, it must be Tuesday," or something.
Right.
It's like, it's hinting very strongly at that meta structure, but not, you don't look in the camera, "It must be Tuesday." Like waggle your eyebrows or whatever.
Exactly. But there's also, like, I was just watching an episode of Buffy today because I'm always watching an episode of Buffy. And there was this thing where, they were like, "Hell's a poppin'," and she's like, "Yeah, it usually comes to a head about every May,"
Right.
she made that comment. And that can be, those kind of things are winks. And I mean, they're winks at the audience and they're winks at the structure, but they don't break the world of the fiction, and in a lighter moment, you don't pay as dearly for that as you do when things are really heavy and emotional.
Yeah, that's never happening, like, in the middle of an intense scene between Buffy and Angel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Joss Whedon would never do that because the thing with Joss Whedon is that he is meticulous about building the world, and building this space that you can believe what's happening. It doesn't have to be realistic, has to be believable, and you can believe that work. But Glenn Gordon Caron, I think, was just doing crazy stuff. Was just because he could. Like, I don't think that he really had this wider understanding of what the cost is, because everything that you decide to do in a story, you get a benefit and you get a cost, and so you have to balance that out, and having a consciousness of what that cost is and saying consciously, yes, I understand that this is the cost for doing this thing, I'm gonna do it anyway. That is deliberate. I feel like Glenn Gordon Caron was just a kid with a couple of 6-shooters just shooting randomly into the air and just being like, where it lands, and that's part of what made it genius. I mean, sometimes I have to say, like, there are creators that are wild and undisciplined, and something about that does create a space for this sort of transcendent genius. So I mean, yeah, he did crazy stuff. A lot of it worked. A lot of it was nuts, but it worked, and it was beautiful, and it was wonderful. I mean, the Shakespeare episode, it was wild, and it was completely outside of any context, any reality for Moonlighting. It opens with a kid, we see a kid watching TV, and his mom sends him upstairs to study his Shakespeare. So this is something that is happening entirely within the head of this kid. That's how we're seeing it. That's the construct for the story. But yet it is so brilliant and hailed to this day as one of the most groundbreaking episodes of television ever. But it's one of those things that had somebody thought about it a little bit more, may not have happened. So, on the one hand, it's like, yes, this is a valid criticism. Here are the things. This is the cost that you paid. But on the other hand, it's like, well, if we hadn't had that wild genius, then what might we have lost if they had been more disciplined or more aware even of what they were doing. So I think that there's a cost and to everything, and you've got to take a look at it and say, is it worth it? And Moonlighting, was brilliant for the first, 3 seasons, did really amazing work. Some of it was crazy. We always had the crazy chase scenes and all that was nuts. And a lot of it was really, really funny. But in the end, it went off the cliff because of all of the same things that made it genius in the beginning, because of all of those same influences. And I think that ends up becoming, like you pay for it, you get this thing, but you're going to have to pay a cost for it.
So do you feel like you learned that from watching the show? Like, you kind of internalized it as a writer and you were like, okay, when I write, I'm going to be funny, but I'm never going to, because I always hear you stress that. And I wonder if it came from this.
Oh no, that came from years and years and years of study. Like when I started writing, I had no idea. I was Glenn Gordon Caron. I had no idea what I was doing. Like I just sat down for NaNoWriMo and I was like, I'm gonna do this thing. Right. Exactly. You know, I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna write this book. And then I wrote it. And then to my surprise, I got an agent with it. And then to my even more extended surprise, I was publishing it, you know, and I was like, wait a minute. I don't know what I'm doing. So it was at that point that I started studying story because I wanted to understand what it was that I was doing. And the more I studied story, the more I got to understand it, the more fascinated I became with it. And so now I look back on Moonlighting or like the really formative texts, you know, of my young life before I knew anything about it. And I know that I had an instinctual understanding of it. Like I felt these things, but I didn't have that processed into intellectual language. So now I've been spending the last 15 years of my life processing all of those responses that you have when you're watching something and you feel something and you kind of have an instinct about it, but you don't know how to explain it. I have spent the last 15 years of my life dedicating myself to trying to understand that. So my ability to speak about it this way now comes from 15 years of study of like deep, nerdy, dedicated study to something that, I had no idea was ever going to pay off in any way. It was just something I was fascinated with,
Mm-hmm.
But as you get a deeper understanding of story and how story functions, then you can understand these things, but you have to be able to process them through like an intellectual space. And when you're responding to something like Moonlighting, the way that I did on just this purely emotional level, the intellectual thoughts and stuff were not conscious for me, but going back, I remember having that feeling when they looked in the camera. I remember having that feeling like, and it's when you're engaging with the story and you have that, there's a moment that makes you go, and you don't know what it is. Like that's when I get fascinated and I want to go back in to figure it out, but at the time I had no idea. And when I was writing, I had no idea. I gradually learned more and more about story as I was writing all of these novels. So by my later novels, I had a much, much greater consciousness of story. But in the beginning, I had no idea. And there's stuff that honestly, that's in my books that was so embedded in my consciousness and my subconsciousness that I didn't even realize I was playing it. Like there's a line in one of the shows where he says, "I hate to be the sugar in your gas tank," right? And I actually have that in one of my books.
Oh wow!
I had no idea that I did it from Moonlighting. It came to me in that moment, and I mean that happens from time to time. Like things, within your experience will show up in your writing. And Moonlighting shows up in my writing in ways that I wasn't even conscious of at the time I wrote it. But then I go back and watch that episode. I'm like, oh, no, I had a character say that once.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I love that.
So I feel like this is the perfect point since we didn't do this at the beginning. If you're interested in hearing more about what Lani has to say about storytelling and structure, you should definitely check out her podcast, How Story Works. And I know Alan and I have referenced it on the show several times before, but for sure, go check that out. It's on iTunes and wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, you can find that everywhere. That's where like all of this nerdy fascination, I'm just putting it all into How Story Works for the people who are interested in that, because that affects everything. Like all the pop culture criticism I do comes from that understanding of story. And every time I engage with a new story, I learn something new. Like a new concept becomes clear to me, and then I see it, repeating itself in other stories throughout. But that's where I get super nerdy about this stuff.
It's fantastic. We use it constantly as a resource and cite it all the time.
Oh,
we love
good.
It.
I'm glad it's helpful. Yeah.
It reminds me of, in the last episode, the quote that you pulled, Anya, from the book that we read, Wild Seed, where the antagonist was talking about he didn't understand, like he knew with his mind, but he didn't know with his heart. And it's like you knew with your heart, but then you had to take a while to learn with your mind. And that's like the work of life in a way. It's so strange that like
it is from one to the other. There are things that we know intellectually that we can't process emotionally, and we have to like pull that in. And then there are things that we understand emotionally, but we haven't processed intellectually.
Absolutely.
And then you have to run it through that process as well. So we're constantly going back and forth to the place when you can understand something both emotionally and intellectually. That is when you have mastered whatever that little thing is, even if it's just a concept, that's when you finally, like, for me, it's like I'm constantly trying to crack these concepts. I see something and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And then I work at it to crack it. And one of my favorite things that I've just recently cracked, which has nothing to do with moonlighting, but I'm going to go off on a tangent because what the hell?
Go for it.
Is this idea of the fractured keys, right? There was this concept that I used to talk about a lot called the time jump, right? Where you take a slice from the climax of whatever the story is that you're telling, you put it at the front, and then you're like 36 hours earlier, whatever. And I've been calling it a time jump for years, but I've never really cracked it. And then finally, I watched Breaking Bad recently, the whole run of Breaking Bad. And Breaking Bad does that, but when they do it, they don't take the most exciting moment where somebody's like, buried alive, or they've got a gun to their head, or they're hanging on a cliff, They would take a quiet moment from the end of that story and put it at the beginning. And that quiet moment wouldn't necessarily have a greater context. It was just something that would make you ask a question. And because you're thinking in terms of that, it ends up actually beautifully, expanding the storytelling of that episode. And so it was then that I understood that not as a time jump, but I renamed it to a fractured tease, because what it is it's a tease at the beginning, and it comes from another spot in the story. So that's the fracture. But the fractured tease I've always hated, and I've always felt it was poor storytelling because it's weak storytelling, because it puts us in this position where we have to build back up to that climax, but you're just teasing the viewer instead of starting out with something that's interesting enough to hold their attention. So seeing the fractured tease done well in Breaking Bad allowed me to really understand it in a much broader context. And so for me, that's exciting. That's like when I start jumping up and down. I'm like, oh my God, I finally cracked this thing. It took me years, but I finally cracked it, and nobody else cares. I'm the only one who's obsessed with this stuff.
So it's basically the difference between the fractured tease done well and the fractured tease done poorly is, are you using it to sort of artificially amp up excitement, or to cast things in a different light and sort of subtly open people's minds in different ways?
Absolutely. And I had never seen it done well, because it's always done in this very insecure way. And to see it done well, that's what got it. So I have to write Vince Gilligan a letter and just thank you so much for, helping me crack this thing, even though you don't know me and you don't care. But for me, it was so great to be able to finally crack that. And so a lot of things that, I've been cracking through Moonlighting have been really fun for me. And Moonlighting is one of the things that helped me really understand that idea of the fourth wall and what it means to break the fourth wall, and so being able to do that, I think, is really fun. So even when Bruce Willis, I of course associate everything with Bruce Willis on this, when Moonlighting, does these kind of wild things that sometimes don't work to its benefit, it is still, teaching us something by the way that it does it. And for me, I think that's also always an incredible thing to be able to get out of any story.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more in depth about Maddie and David and sort of their attraction and them as a template for other romances going forward.
Oh yeah, no, they've ruined so much of romance. The influence of Dave and Maddie specifically, but also Sam and Diane, all of your slap kiss couples have, and I've been writing romance fiction for 15 years, and because of that, because of my work in teaching people and doing workshops, I end up getting a lot of material to read and critique for people. And one of the things that one of the bad habits that has become just so prevalent in romance writing for a lot of people is this idea of, oh, he's so annoying, right? That they meet, this couple meets, and, we're supposed to think they're just so great. And then they have all this great chemistry, and he's really hot and she's really hot, and they're going to be hot together and all that kind of stuff. And then the only sense of romantic conflict is just, oh, he's annoying, and they have to have that, that fight and that bicker. The thing that makes a couple work, is not the fighting and the bickering. It's not that, because it's how well they work together. When you have a couple that works well together, and when you've got a mystery show where we've got detectives who have to solve it in 45 minutes, right? They're going to work. They have to work well together, because if they don't, then you're just going to end up with nothing. So it's how well they work together that really makes it work. Now, there is a certain spark to the banter and to the romantic banter, but that's not romantic conflict. That's a different thing. And so when you feel like in order to have a couple, you are absolutely required that they fight and hate each other, that's not it. That's not what you need. The spark and the passion and all of that is really great. But what you want, what makes a couple work, is how well they work together. And then when they fight, that's because of the essential romantic conflict. The conflict with Dave and Maddie is that these people are so different. They're so incredibly different. Like, how are they ever going to get along? And then that brought in a lot of that romantic conflict. And it was something that was powerful with Dave and Maddie. It's powerful with Sam and Diane and Cheers, because they are at the core of who they are, so incredibly different. But that's actually builds an obstacle that you have to get over, because when you see people fighting all the time, you're like, I don't want these people together. They're going to make each other miserable, which is what happened with Sam and Diane, what happened with Dave and Maddie. Eventually they made each other miserable. So it's really not the great path to, a love story of the ages. It's not going to be a romance that we can believe in, that we can feel good about when they're together, unless they've both arced and changed out of that. But it is not a requirement for couples, in romances, to find each other annoying. That's one of these little vestigial tales that sort of Moonlighting is put into the romantic, the pool out there that people keep drinking from, and it's not working. To mix 8 or 12 metaphors in there. But it's not good. Like, you have to understand where that comes from, and you have to do it right. Just making people hate each other so that you can have them hate each other is not valuable. And if you make them that different, that they're going to fight like that, then you have to pay the cost for that later by arcing them together towards something that, when it's over, we can see them having a happy future together, because that's what you want at the end of a romantic story, and you really do. Again, it's like all about that. You have to understand the price that you pay for the things that you do in those stories. And the price that we pay with Dave and Maddie is that they are so different. They don't see anything the same way. And in a lot of ways, they kind of hate each other. So all of that leads us to something that, like, this is not going to be a happy romantic pairing for these people unless somebody changes, unless somebody, arcs. And they would arc them a little bit and then arc them right back. And it just never really took. But because the fighting was so hot, because that worked so well and it was so engaging, a lot of times we'll find romantic couples in movies, TV, and books written that way without an understanding of what that means. You also have to do. You're taking responsibility for also creating this romance and making it work despite that, But the best romances are the ones where people work well together.
Absolutely.
So you think people kind of took the wrong lesson away from this romance, that basically, so we'll have some articles linked in the show notes. And I think everyone is pretty much on the same page that the Moonlighting curse is bogus. That, like,
yes,
the idea that you will ruin your show if you get your two leads together, that's completely false.
Well, everybody agrees on that now, but it has ruined a fair number of television romances. I mean, the X-Files, for one,
Oh, man.
Well, although
Oh,
there
my
were a
God.
lot of other influences screwing up the Mulder and Scully relationship. But, there are a lot of things where they do that, where the Bones, I think they held off on getting those two together for like ages, past where it would have, and they worked really well together. I mean, they were really good. So, I think that, for the most part, everybody agrees, but that's because we've just seen so many television shows have such a fear of the cautionary tale that was Moonlighting that they went in the opposite direction. You have to understand how the narrative forces are working underneath the surface of all of these things in order to be able to address them, and to be able to work with them. And if you don't understand it, if all you know is they had sex and then the show died,
Right.
you've got correlation that is not causation. They had sex, and then you put Maddie in Chicago for 8 episodes and had her marry somebody else and had her be pregnant and not tell David about it, and then have her tell David that it wasn't his kid. But then we find out that it was his kid. And, and if it wasn't his kid, it was Sam's kid. And why is she not telling Sam that she's carrying his child, if that's the case. And then she marries somebody else on a train that she's known for an hour. And the whole thing is so insane and so stupid. That's what killed your show. It wasn't that they slept together, but people saw they slept together and then the show died. And they make that association without looking deeper into the text to find out what really happened there.
Or I think another way to look at it is that basically what killed the show was not that you can't write people after they get together, but just that this writer didn't know how to write people after they got together, right? Like if all you know is the slap, slap, kiss, kiss, then...
Right.
And that they really failed to arc the characters into a place where they could be compatible. That like, that if your romantic conflict initially is that they are attracted yet incompatible, then at some point your long-term arc has to be about making them become compatible.
Yeah, like arcing them toward each other, making it work. That's what you do with a romantic story. That's what you want to do. But I think that what happened is that, like Moonlighting crashed and burned so fast and so hard from such a height. It was so successful. It did so great that you see that. And this is the story that, TV writers tell their little TV writers when they tuck them into bed at night, like don't have them sleep together, because it's terrifying. And this is like, people are telling these stories, but like a deep textual analysis of television is something that just wasn't happening at that time. Like people weren't looking at it. That's why they were like, okay, here, give me a guy and a girl and a detective show, go. And we'll pay you millions of dollars for it. We don't care how it is. Because all they saw was the success of the guy and the girl and the detective show. But they didn't understand that textually underneath that, the success was, we have here a romantic pairing where two people are working together well. That's what does it. That's the thing that people want. And so if you understand that, but at the time, like nobody took TV seriously. Nobody thought about TV in terms of its storytelling. Nobody was analyzing this stuff. You had like TV critics who were like, yeah, I like Moonlighting. No, I don't like Moonlighting. And that's it, But this deeper textual analysis of how the narrative was functioning in these stories just wasn't being done. So they saw this, they took correlation as causation. And then that's what happened. And the effect on television for years and years to come, until people started looking at television with a much, much deeper critical, thought applied. Everybody just thought that that's what it was. So yeah, like now we all are like, well, it's obviously bogus because people have looked more deeply into the storytelling. But at the time, nobody was analyzing it that way. So they just knew people like detective shows with a hot guy and a hot girl.
Right.
Do it, and they weren't looking any more deeply at what was actually happening in the storytelling there.
Yeah. When I was rewatching the show, I kept thinking of Star Wars actually with Princess Leia and Han Solo, where you have like this very capable, in charge, like, in Princess Leia, and then here with Maddie, like she's very, focused and driven, and like she has it together in a way that he absolutely does not. Like he's a mess, and Han Solo's like that. He's a lout. But he's kind of lazy and he just does his own thing and whatever. And like you say, there's these sparks, there's this slap, slap, kiss, kiss. There's all this energy and it's really fantastic, but they are incompatible. And what I actually liked when I was thinking about this, watching the show, was that in Star Wars, they actually acknowledge that. Like when you come back in The Force Awakens and you find out that, yeah, they had a kid and they never really stayed together because they just couldn't make it work. And I love that actually. So, I don't know, J.J. Abrams ever watched Moonlighting. I'm sure that he was absolutely aware of it with the, TV guy that he is. But it was nice to see the acknowledgement of these incompatible people. Just because we wanted them to get together doesn't mean it'll work out necessarily. Like the narrative work wasn't done to make it believable.
Yeah, you have to do the work. In the same way you have to do the work in a relationship in real life, you have to do the work to make it work narratively. I think J.J. Abrams actually does have a very good, I don't know if Moonlighting is part of it, but he does have a very good consciousness of how these relationships work and how important it is in the narrative to honor that. And one of my least favorite tropes is the woman, she's got it together, she's living like an adult, she's all this, but she's so uptight, she's an ice princess, and he's so cool and he's so funny, the way he comes in drunk to meetings, and we're supposed to look at her and be like, oh, why are you so uptight? He just came in drunk. Like, God, let a guy have some fun. Right. Boys will be boys, and that's the kind of thing that drives me crazy about that trope, because yes, it is nice to have opposites attract, and we all love our roguish, male hero, but it's always the woman who ends up, like carrying all of the weight of that and being the one that everybody hates, because she's like, oh no, you actually have to like run a business and be a reasonable adult, even in the episode My Fair David, right? Where they make a bet and she's like, I bet you can't be an adult for 1 week, right? And then he's behaving like an adult only in front of her, but behaving like an adult, and then everybody's mad at her because she's making him grow up. And I'm like, okay, no, not fair. That sucks. The only reason any of you get a paycheck and can pay your rent is because this woman is making this business work. So, slow your roll a little bit there. But everybody's so upset because you de-Daved him and he's not Dave anymore. And we love Dave and Dave's great. Dave's a party, and meanwhile, Maddie is the one who's making sure that your lights are still on. So I kind of hate that trope, because the woman is, all of the weight is on her to make everything work and to make everything come together and to do all the stuff that he doesn't want to do because he's having a great time being a rogue hero, And I mean, I'm not going to lie. I love me some Han Solo. Obviously, I love me some David Addison. Like, I'm not going to lie. I'm as susceptible to it as anybody, but it's not a trope that I find particularly enlightened or helpful in any way.
Yeah. And in a similar vein, I feel like the show does have a lot of depictions of, I think, what today we would call toxic masculinity. Sure. And in the show, it's really just framed as sort of like, boys will be boys, or like, the inevitable showdown of like men versus women, feminism versus
reality,
toxic masculinity,
versus being a perpetual child. Yeah. Right. This idea that boys will be boys. I mean, it's right there. Like, boys will be boys, honestly, is one of the phrases that infuriates me more than anything, because it excuses behavior that is absolutely inexcusable. But the whole thing that, like, it's so, isn't it cute when he does these things? Isn't it cute when he objectifies women? Isn't it cute when he, sexually harasses Maddie in front of the staff? Like, isn't that adorable? Oh, he's so sweet. Let him blink his eyelashes at me and I'm going to fall for it, And we see that a lot in cultural storytelling. And what that does is it reinforces this idea that it's cute when men behave like boys. And I personally don't find that. No, I mean, okay, I'm lying. Obviously I do. I love it. I love Han Solo. I love David Addison. Like, it sickens me, but I do. But I think that there should be like a price to pay for that we shouldn't act like that behavior. It's adorable, and they're very funny. But when it comes down to the serious stuff, when it comes down to like push comes to shove, Han Solo steps up. Han Solo is a man, like when it comes right down to it, at least he's not as egregious, an example of this is like maybe David Addison, but I think that it's one of those things that, again, like, you pay a cost for everything that you do in narrative. And part of that cost is this idea that we're making that kind of toxic masculinity cute. Isn't it cute when boys don't grow up, when it's this Peter Pan syndrome, And like, yeah, on TV, it may be cute. Marry that right. And tell me how cute it is a few years later, Yeah. So it's, it's a challenging thing to kind of deal with, because, yeah, it's adorable on the screen. And isn't he fun? But when it comes right down to it, like, he's got to be a man when being a man is required, and she's got to be allowed to have her moments. Like, she has, when she decides toward the end of season 3 that she's feeling reckless, that she just wants to go out and get laid, and have a good time. He is so horrified by that. So horrified. The judgment that he puts on her because she wants to do on one weekend in 3 years what he has done every weekend of the entire run of the show. Like, that I find appalling, and the way that we are, made to look at her like, oh my God, what a whore, And then in the end, when she sleeps with somebody, it's somebody she's known from her childhood, her whole life. It's somebody safe. It's somebody that she's had this relationship with forever. It's not a one night stand. And so we wouldn't even go there with her. We made it look like the fact that she might even want to do it. She was so slut shamed for that in that episode. And that drives me crazy.
Yeah, the intro scene to the dream sequence always rings twice drove me crazy, I think, in a little bit of a similar way. So they're arguing about a historical murder that they just heard about, and this woman was having an affair and then her husband died, and they're arguing over who they think killed the husband. Was it the woman or was it the man she was having an affair with?
Sad.
What's that?
That murder. Sad to think that an innocent person had to die just because she fell for the wrong guy.
Wait a second. There's a page missing out of my copy of the script. What do you mean the wrong guy? They never solved the Flamingo Cove murder, Maddie. It is entirely possible that he was the right guy and she was the wrong girl.
Yeah, sure, I suppose.
What do you mean you suppose?
I suppose she could have killed him, but I'm sure he did it.
How can you be sure?
Common sense.
Common sense?
Common sense.
There's no talking to you.
You can talk to me.
No, I can't.
Yes, you can.
No, I can't.
Yes, you can.
No, I can't. And you want to know why I can't?
I'm on the edge of my
Because
seat.
of the way you look at things. You look at everything like a woman first and then a person second.
What does that mean?
I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. You don't look at a situation objectively. You don't look at a situation like an individual. You look at a situation like somebody appointed you guardian for your whole damn sex.
That's not true. And what do you mean, whole damn sex?
See?
Addison, for your information, I think of myself as an individual first and a woman second in that order.
You just keep saying that. Maybe you'll talk yourself into it.
What does that mean?
You just accuse a man of murder. Of murder, Maddie. Based on what? Based on the fact that he was a man.
Addison, clearly, he had more reasons to kill him than she did.
Name one.
Her! He wanted her! He had to kill her husband to have her.
That's crazy. Why buy the cow when you get the milk for free?
What?
You heard me.
You're an animal.
And you're a sexist.
What?
You're a sexist. You know what a sexist is?
Of course I know what a sexist is. I'm looking at one.
So am I. You think the boyfriend killed the husband just because he was a man, and that makes you a sexist.
I am not a sexist.
Oh, you're a
I am not a
sexist.
sexist. I'm not speaking to you. I'm
R2.
not. I'm not.
R2.
I'm not. I'm not.
R2.
I'm not. Not another word. Not another sound. Not another peep until we get back to the office.
And they end up in this argument, which is like well written and fun in that way that a lot of their fights and shouting at each other are fun. But his argument is basically like, you're sexist because you see gender. I don't see gender.
Right.
I'm gender blind. And it's just like, it was like so frustrating. It was like, yeah, there's no way that would fly today. You can tell that this is a show from the 80s. It's like,
very much of its time. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dear listeners, if you decide to go and watch Moonlighting, there's a lot of really fun moments, but you also have to keep in mind that like it is definitely a product of its time.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, written predominantly by men.
Yeah.
There were women on the writing staff, but I mean, the people that were conceiving stories, for predominant, people who were telling stories at that time were white men, right? And there are certain things like when you have privilege, and I'm a white woman, so like I am not going to claim I have no privilege. I have tons of privilege, right? When you have it, it is so hard to see it because that's just the way it is for you. That's just the way life is. Like you go out and that's how the world works, right? So when you write from a position of privilege and you are not woke to that privilege yet, this kind of stuff gets in there, and the thing is that it was in the culture. I mean, it didn't, Glenn Gordon Caron didn't come out, all evil, like I'm going to ruin the culture. Like he just came from the ground from which he sprung. Like that was the way his experience was. And that was how he saw the world. And so now, in 2017, we've woken up quite a bit, I think, not all of us by any means, but to a great extent, to where we're much more sensitive to those kinds of cultural messages that we are sending as read. We're sending these messages as though this is the way it is, not this is the way some people see it, or fail to see it, So when you look back at, stuff that was done, the TV shows in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you see all the cultural presumptions that ride underneath everything that's happening within those stories. And they are told by people of privilege and people who have a lot of blind spots to this broader context of stories, which is why, of course, we need diversity in our storytelling, because we need to be able to see stories that are from different perspectives, that opens everybody up and that opens us up to better stories, which to me is, you know, like what I'm after. Like I want, you know, social consciousness, but I want better stories. And I think that the more diversity we have in our storytellers, the more interesting stories we're going to be told.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, as someone who was a toddler when the show aired, it's like, it's hard for me to understand that context really, aside from knowing that it's not the context that I understand. But like, I wonder, was it good that they had this argument about feminism on TV? Like, there are probably people who heard that argument who maybe hadn't thought about feminism or like what it is like to actually live your life as a woman in society and how that might be different if you're a man. But then there's also people who are watching that and thinking, you know, David Addison has a really good point. I think she is the sexist one, you know? And so it's like hard to know how much are you helping versus hurting in that situation. And looking back at the show from 2017, it's hard to know what the writer's perspective even was. Like, did they think that both sides were legitimate, or were they trying to show that, like, yet again, he's sort of an immature fuck up?
I think that they were trying to show it from both sides. I mean, I think that they genuinely thought he had a point there. You know, that she was sexist because all she saw was that it was a man, and because it was a man, you know, and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know. That was the impression that I got from it. That was the way that I read it. Is that they were actually saying that, oh, look, you're so feminist, but you're actually the one who's sexist. See, I turned that around on you. Like, I think that there's part of that there, you know? And then, of course, his fantasy goes into this whole, you know, I mean, basically vagina dentata thing, you know, which is all about how the woman, you know, lures the man, and then she's, you know, eventually going to you know, bite off his penis or whatever, because that's the big fear, right? Men are afraid of women because women have these powerful vaginas, and, you know, and it's so scary. They're all afraid of that. No, I think you have been. I think there's some of that in a lot of the misogyny that's out there, that men are afraid of the power that women have over them, and so they do what they can to eliminate that power.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just human, you know, nature. That's been that way for ages. Whenever the party in power is feeling themselves threatened, they immediately attack the powerless. Because they might have a tiny little bit of power, and we just simply cannot have that. So there's tons of discussion to be had on that, on a greater, like, societal, you know, space. But I think that what our stories do at the time that they are released is that they simply reflect us back at ourselves. So while we can sit here and say, oh yeah, David's being a big jerk and a man child, David did not, you know, form just out of nowhere. He is very much a product of the culture in which he was introduced, and extremely popular. So the thing that we need to critique is not necessarily the work itself or the people who did it, because they grew up, they were part of a culture. They were just reflecting a culture back at us. You know, the thing to critique is the mindset that we have that creates that, where we can just presume that this is the way it is, that boys will be boys, and isn't that cute, without questioning it. And that's where, you know, where we really need to critique. So when you look back at these stories, you know, you use these stories to critique the broader culture at the time, but it's really not necessarily the fault of these people who are simply reflecting that culture back at us. You know, I mean, the problem was with us in the first place.
Yeah. And I think the episode actually really holds up in another way, in that the way it's structured is really interesting, right? So they sort of find out about this murder, and then they both have dreams that show what they think happened. And so in Maddie's dream, it was the woman gets seduced by this lover into a relationship that she didn't necessarily want. He's like really not respecting her consent in a lot of ways. And then he kills her husband, even though she doesn't want it, right? And then in David's dream, she's the one who seduces him and basically like gets him to do her dirty work for her. And it's like a really powerful illustration, I think, of how our perspectives influence the way that we see the world, and how different point of views can really narrativize the same set of facts and lead to completely different conclusions. And like in 2017, that itself is a really powerful message.
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. Because none of it's evidence-based.
Yeah.
Neither one of them have any information. Either of those stories could actually be true.
Yeah.
But what is most interesting is the way that we are creating this internal narrative for each of them about what happened based on their perspective and the way that they see the world. So that, I think, is one of the most powerful, examples of how we take reality, and reality is actually incredibly malleable based on the stories that we tell about it. Like the stories that we tell ourselves all the time form our reality. And when we don't engage with actual demonstrable reality, we can fly off into spaces that are not even related to what actually happened, so I find that to be really interesting, because the stories we tell, like in the way that when we have these stories in the 1980s that are being told, it reflects our culture back at us. The stories we tell also convince us of what is true about the world. And sometimes we need to take a critical look, not just at the stories that we are being told, but at the stories that we tell ourselves.
I really like, on that same kind of note, the meta layer that's going on in that episode too, because when they have the dreams, they're cast in black and white. They're from the time, that the murder happened, which is like in a more glamorous past. But at the same time, it's like referencing a filmic tradition that the show, I think, pulls a lot of its energy from, like the romantic comedies of the 1940s, or like Humphrey Bogart. Like David Addison has a lot of like Humphrey Bogart dryness to him sometimes, in my opinion.
Oh, sure. Well, he's even wearing the white suit from Casablanca, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like the show is like saying something in that episode of like, these are the influences of the head writer. This is like these are the detectives that I'm thinking of. These are the kind of movies that I'm talking about, where men were men, where women were women, and this is like my paradigm. And then I'm infusing it with, with this modern, like, oh, we're going to talk about feminism. We're going to talk, a powerful woman who runs her own business. And this is all like kind of enlightened. And when you look at it, 20, 30 years later, you're like, maybe not so enlightened as you might be thinking there.
Right, but it moved the needle though, right? I mean, you can't,
totally.
like Rome wasn't built in a day. Like, I mean, Moonlighting did move the needle a little bit. I mean, I think that it was taking almost as many shots at feminism as it was being a feminist story, because Maddie, for all of her strength and power and capability, was a complete hot mess. And which actually makes her much more interesting as a character. But you have to balance all of that stuff too. And I think that you have to have a certain consciousness, but you also only have the ability to reflect back what what you understand. And having those stories, to be able to tell them in that way, I think gives us something to talk about, gives us a place to start. And fiction is where we go to understand reality. So I mean, that's where it all starts, and the ability to agree or disagree with whatever the messages are that are being told. And I think we're much more likely to think critically about it today than we were back then. That's an incredibly beautiful thing. So, so I want to refrain from being like super like, oh my God, these people were so terrible, because they weren't. They were just reflecting it back, But I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff that they did in there that actually speaks really nicely to the power of our own personal narratives.
Totally. And I didn't mean to like necessarily attack it, but just to say that like,
oh, I don't think you were. I've been attacking. I just want to pull that back.
I think he's making a commentary on like, the kind of films and stuff that influenced him and his vision. And then we get to look back at even like all of that stuff. Like you're seeing through all these different lenses, all these different stories. And
right. You're going even further back culturally,
Right. Cool. That's great.
So do you have anything else that you want to say about sort of like Moonlighting and what it means to you, or, how it influenced you about writing? Or we could go just into your experience recommending this to other people and talking about our list of episodes.
Yeah, I think I've actually talked more about Moonlighting now than I ever have in years. So it's been really, really
Hey,
fun.
that's great.
So I think I've hit most of the things that I really wanted to talk about. But like, yeah, I recommend Moonlighting definitely to people because I think that if you're interested in television at all, if you're interested in television history, I mean, it is such a huge, huge moment in television history. And one of the things that I absolutely love about it is that this is one of the first instances in which we had a showrunner writer at the helm. That didn't happen a lot. All of the shows prior to this sort of stage in television, where a producer would come up with an idea. I want two detectives, make them fight, go, and that would be it. And then somebody would just make that happen, and the writers would just write whatever the producer comes up with. The producer came up with the idea and the writers wrote it, but the producer was the one who was at the helm. Like, you look back on all like the Norman Lear shows, the Gene Roddenberry, like all of this stuff, that it was all about the producer having the idea, and then the writers were like these monkeys at typewriters who just made it happen. This is where we see this transition into this space where Glenn Gordon Caron as a writer was just as famous as, well, maybe not just as famous, but he was right up there. He was on the covers of the magazines. People were talking about him as an entity. Now we're really used to that now. We've got our Aaron Sorkin, our Amy Sherman Palladino, our J.J. Abrams. Everything is about who is creating this story, right? When we talk about television shows now, like Vince Gilligan, right? From Breaking Bad, like we talk about the creator, the writer, and that was something that just was not part of television prior to Moonlighting. Glenn Gordon Caron came in and made such a splash as a creator that's when we have this transition. We have this transition from producer led to showrunner creator. This is the thing that made Shonda Rhimes possible. This is the thing that made Chris Carter possible with X-Files, which started just a couple of years after that. We have this transition. Joss Whedon happened because of Moonlighting. Moonlighting is the transition point where we became conscious of, we want a creator who can write, who knows these stories, who can delve into them, who can make them more engaging, rather than like an Aaron Spelling, who comes in with an idea and has like 12 shows on the air that all do the same kind of nighttime soap opera drama thing.
Dick Wolf.
It's you have somebody who's actually at the helm. Yeah, it's actually like writing the stories, and that is a completely different thing. That is a sea change in television, and that is when television turned into what it is now. I mean, at the time, it was not regarded as, it was popcorn. It wasn't regarded as like real storytelling, but now I would say the primary, the prominent force in storytelling in our culture now is television. That's what we all go to. So I find that to be a really interesting, thing that Moonlighting did and that Glenn Gordon Caron did. We saw some of that happening, but that was the real moment that hit. That became a thing. And then people started looking, television studios started looking for the showrunner creator, the person who could run it through. So I thought that was really interesting about Moonlighting. I love that it has that place in television history. That's really interesting. But recommending it to people, I absolutely do. Nobody can get a hold of it,
right.
So it's kind of pointless because you can't get it anywhere. I think if you're interested in the history of television, it is an absolutely pivotal show with which you need to be familiar. And I think that just as a vehicle for fun, it has a tremendous amount of fun involved. So there are a lot of good reasons to watch Moonlighting. I absolutely do recommend it if you can get your hands on. I mean, maybe on eBay there are some DVDs that you can get your hands on. But I mean, if you want to watch Moonlighting, you have to work for it. You have to really want to watch Moonlighting. It's not something that you can just kind of like passively do. You got to put the legwork into it. But I think that anybody who really wants to understand television, who wants a greater understanding of storytelling, who wants a greater understanding of romantic comedy and how to do it and how not to do it, Moonlighting is a wonderful text to study.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm sort of new to the TV analysis story thing, but like Buffy is sort of like has been my starting point up until now for thinking about modern television. It was really cool to sort of go back and look at this and be like, oh, all of these things that I thought, like Buffy was the first to do, or like and X-Files to some extent before that. It's like, okay, well, Moonlighting did it before X-Files and Buffy. And as an evolutionary biologist, it's also cool to sort of like see that phylogeny
Oh, sure.
Fill in all of the missing links.
Yeah, no, I mean, everybody's standing on the shoulders of giants. There are so many things. Nothing that exists now would exist if it weren't for what came before. And so like being able to look back at that and see that progression, for me is fascinating. I love television history. I love looking back at the shows because I think it also reflects us back at ourselves. I think that you can understand the culture by understanding the television shows and the stories that it tells. I mean, it's essentially a study in folklore.
Totally. Oh yeah, folklore. I love that. That's a great analogy to, that kind of ephemeral television that we got from like the 70s and 80s when they thought that like this will never be on the air again, or like if it's in syndication, great for us. But they didn't, like, there was not a heavy investment in thinking about things and making it great. And sometimes like things squeaked through that were pretty amazing. And yeah, I would recommend it to like anybody, just like you're saying, that it's still genuinely funny. Like, it was surprising. And we talk on this show a lot about like story perversity, we've called it. Like Buffy has it, where you get the unexpected, movement of a scene or a line, or, me, you, and everyone we know was like full of story perversity, like doing things the wrong way. And this show is like chock full of it. Like, as soon as that stuff started happening, or the Shakespeare episode where the horse walks in with giant sunglasses on its face, I'm like, okay, I'm in for this. Like, this is my thing. I love it. So I don't know. Anytime a story is like, yeah, whatever, we're just going to be crazy, like, that is charming to me. And if you like that kind of thing, I would recommend the show.
Yeah. And so if you look in the show notes, we'll have a list of, I think it's 7 recommended episodes and some articles talking about moonlighting and its importance in the context of TV more broadly. And so the list of 7 episodes includes the 2-part pilot that was actually aired as a movie. So I think that was also sort of revolutionary, right? Like, a lot of TV shows do that now, where their first episode is either like bigger or some sort of like special feature. My understanding is that was like pretty rare back when Moonlighting came out.
Yeah, at the time, the way a television show was done was that you would do a pilot episode, right? And in a pilot episode, like, the weight that is on a pilot episode, you have to tell a story, you have to tell an episodic story, but you also have to introduce the world, build the world, get your characters in place, show us who they are. The kind of work that has to go into a pilot episode of anything is astounding. And to do that in, a regular length episode is pretty tough. What happens more often now is that we don't have pilot episodes. We'll have like a season order, just based on the promise of it. So they will say, all right, you have 13 episodes. Back in the time frame that Moonlighting was working, it was a pilot episode, and then you would just do the pilot and then hope that it got picked up. And if it got picked up, you would be able to tell the rest of the story from there. You weren't able to plan for anything more than that. So it was kind of just a different system. We're moving away from that system much, much more now. But at the time, that's the way it was done. Now, he got, I believe, for the first season, a 6-episode order. So they were able to say, all right, do the first one as a movie, give us, the full, 2-hour experience, or hour and a half once you figure in commercials. And you can do that. And then we're going to do the next, handful of episodes as well. So, I mean, it's my understanding that that was one of the first shows that got a multi-episode order right off the bat. And that allowed them to do something a little bit different, a little bit bolder.
Yeah, very, very cool. So on our episode list, we have the pilot, we have some of Lani's favorite episodes, and then we have 2 episodes that are noted in the TV Guide Best TV Episodes of All Time, a number 34 from 1997, and that was the dream sequence Always Rings Twice, the one with the black and white flashbacks, and then the number 48 episode from 2009, which is the Shakespeare episode that Lani and Alan have been talking about.
It's crazy.
It is. It's really fantastic. It's really good.
Okay, well, I think that wraps us up for this week.
And this past month, we've had a few people leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app, which we really appreciate. And as promised, for everybody who leaves a review, we write a individualized haiku.
Okay, so today's first haiku goes out to Suzanne, or Suzaboos. Books and plays call you. Instead, you listen to us. This makes it worth it.
We also got a review from Carrie Wiedenwords. Ocean between us. Friendship builds a bridge across. We're found family.
And then finally, we got a lovely review from Sarah L. When needed, you help. Courage of your convictions. Glad we stand with you. So thank you very much to Suzanne, Carrie, and Sarah L. for leaving us reviews. It's the best way for new listeners to find us. And for the rest of you guys, if you want to leave us a review, you'll get your own poem.
And then coming up for next month, for March, we are going to have another guest. We're very excited about having Jan Moffat on the show from Way Too Seriously and from Clockworks, a Legion podcast. She is going to be talking about a book that you suggested to me that I read to my girls.
Yeah, so the book, it's actually a children's book. It's called The Paper Bag Princess, and it is one of my favorite books. It's the only kids book that I actually still own from my childhood. And I really wanted to talk about it on the show. And then I found out just from talking to Jan that she actually had a Paper Bag Princess tattoo. And I was like, damn, that is devotion to a book.
Great.
Now I feel unqualified to talk about this. There's no way we can do an episode without inviting you on. So we invited her on. So it's a great book, and I'm really excited to actually hear the story behind the tattoo because I don't know that yet. I only know that she has it. And yeah, it's my favorite book from when I was growing up.
It's very cute. I've read it to both of my girls, and we might even have some feedback from them maybe. So it will, we've never tried to do like a children's book before, but with like, we want to have, I'm really proud, as far as our show goes, is like the kind of diversity of subjects that we have. So this will be interesting, I think, because the book, even though it's really short, there's a lot going on with this book, and Jan is so smart, and it's like your favorite book. So I think we're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, and you didn't really mention the topic of Jan's podcast, Way Too Seriously, that she does with her husband, Paul Moffat. They talk about kids' movies. So I think Jan is definitely an expert at taking kids' media seriously and analyzing it in a really in-depth and fun and interesting way.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite podcasts. Like, everybody should check that out.
And guys, don't forget to rate and review the show on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever you want to call it. It's the best way for us to find new listeners and to promote the show. And thank you, Lani, again so much for talking with us today. Can you tell our listeners where to find you on the very small chance that they don't already know?
That they haven't already found. Yes. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. It was so much fun to talk about moonlighting with you guys. Absolute blast. Thank you so much for that opportunity. Anybody who wants to find me can find me on Twitter at Lani Diane Rich. You can find my novels at LaniDianeRich.com, and you can find my podcasting at chipperish.com.
And we will have links to all that in the show notes.
And I'm Anya, and you can follow me on Twitter at Strangely Literal. That's strangely, then LITERL.
I'm Alan, and you can follow me on Twitter at ChipperAlan. You can follow the show on Twitter at HGStorycast, and visit our website at hgstorycast.com.
And if you'd like to leave us feedback, you can visit hgstorycast.com/contact or send an email to contact@hallowedgroundmedia.com.
Thanks so much, guys.
Hallowed Ground Storycast is a Hallowed Ground media production and is produced under a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike license.